Hi, didn't see you there. Welcome to day one of the distance learning experience for Ling 2201, Introduction to Linguistics. The last time we talked, we were talking about dialects of North American English. That is stuff out of chapter 13 of the Contemporary Linguistics textbook. We are going to finish up our discussion of chapter 13 today, talking about concepts related to sociolectal variation. So next time we're going to cover some things that are mostly off the textbook, including issues related to language and culture. That is issues like linguistic relativism and all sorts of fun stuff like that. If I have a reading for you, I will let you know. But otherwise, don't worry about it for right now. Next week after that, however, so then next Tuesday, we'll be talking about historical linguistics, and typology. That is chapters 7 and 8, and we'll pretty much go in that order, chapter 7 and then chapter 8. We're going to try to move beyond the study of just dialects today and think about language variation from a number of different perspectives. Within this, we're asking some big questions. How much variation is there? Like we started to see last time that English has some pretty common processes that we go through. There's changes with the vowels, changes with R's, but just how much variation can we still have among different dialects of English? But it's not just how much variation there is. It's how do speakers use that variation, right? How do they understand it? How do they perceive it? How do they categorize the world involving that variation? According to some really great sociolinguists, Mary Buckholtz and Kira Hall, they have an answer that says that your identity that you communicate to the world doesn't emerge at just one level of language. Not just your vowels, whether you say bag or bag, not just which code you choose to use, whether that's standard American English or some other dialect, but actually multiple levels simultaneously. Linguistics plays a role, language plays a role in your identity. Last time we were talking about how languages vary and how that variation is just totally natural, and how sociolinguists investigate that variation. And we focused a lot on regional dialectal variation as just one kind of level of variation. But we should really think a lot more about a whole bunch of other kinds of variation as well. And remember, I said you won't be tested on this sort of a model. This is just one model among many. The book has some slightly different maps in here, but it's all sort of the same for our purposes. There's some big, broad similarities. On a similar note, we should talk about a link that I put on the Moodle. It's called I Bought a Bag of Bagels. I'll try my best to pronounce that. And I want you to think about and read this article. I'll put a reflection question up on the Moodle for your weekly homework. It's going to involve you thinking about the way you pronounce this vowel and the way that you understand the pronunciation of this vowel, the way you perceive it to be pronounced. So whether that's you pronouncing bag like
bagel, bag, back.
Or whether you pronounce bag like
bagel, bag, back.
In either case, I wanted you to think about how you pronounce that word and how you think about other people how they pronounce that word. Anyway, on to the main content of today's lecture, sociolects, sociolectal variation. When we think about social dialects, we think about speaker characteristics that sort of associate you with different groups, right? And not just any kind of a regional group or something like that, but a social group. It seems that we kind of program ourselves, and we're programmed from a young age to speak like people we like people we hang out with, like the people that we're raised by in our communities. Whereas when we think about dialects, we're thinking about geographic sorts of variation. Sociolectal variation cuts across all of that. And we talked a little bit about this last time, and we'll talk a little bit more about it today. But in terms of what is a social group, almost anything is a social group, right? A community of practice is one really important way of thinking about social groups. We mentioned this last time, but a social group in terms of a community of practice is when you have people coming together in mutual engagement to do something together in some sort of shared understanding of what that task is, and that provides a shared sort of base or pool of things, of performance options for those people in their language. Performance, so this can be something really explicit, like the football team, the linguistics class, as we mentioned last time. But it could also be, the nerds of your school. Who were the nerds? I was one of the nerds. Who were the burnouts? Who were the jocks? Who were the cool kids? Were there preppies? Those sorts of communities are just as relevant and just as interesting to sociolinguistics and sociocultural linguistics. There are a number of social factors that we mentioned sort of last time as far as language variation is concerned. Age plays a difference, right? You have different lexical choices than your grandparents do. Gender, religion, ethnicity, nationality, profession, what job you want to do, all sorts of things. And it's not just one of these things makes a difference either, right? Intersectionality is more than just a buzzword. Intersectionality, well, why do I say it? Why don't I let Kim Crenshaw say it?
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem.
Intersectionality you may have as a loaded word in your sort of background. I won't judge that. But as far as the social science is concerned, intersectionality is just the simple fact that you're more than one thing at a time, right? I am both white and a man at the same time. That's part of my experience. A really good way of kind of thinking about class in particular, as far as its effects on sociolinguistics, class was one of the first things that we really started to investigate. So we'll talk mostly today about class and race and a couple of other issues that sort of come around that. But we'll talk a little bit about gender as well as what we're sort of end on. But in terms of class, William Labov pictured here, really well-known study, really famous study called the social stratification of R in New York City department stores. Now, we learned last time about this R pronunciation that it's sort of a dialectal feature, right? If you're in New York, if you're in the sort of eastern seaboard area, that particular region of New England, you expect people might not have R. But it's not so simple. It's not just where you are. It's actually how you perceive of yourself and what kind of social groups you run in. So the hypothesis for William Labov's really interesting study was that there's going to be a social ranking of R-lessness. He suggested that the more upscale, upper class sorts of folks, they were going to keep their R's. They were going to pronounce those R's. And that people who were on the sort of lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder, that they were going to be the ones to lose those R's. And that actually is something that he wanted to go out and test. And so how do you go out and test those things? Well, he decided to use department stores as a proxy for class. You can't just go out and ask people, what class are you, right? That's sort of not getting at the information the right way. He wanted to catch people's usages of these words in their sort of natural habitat. So he went out to Saks Fifth Avenue, the ritzy department store, high-end, high fashion on 50th Street, 5th Avenue, nice, the heart of the city. And as you can see here, much higher end than both Macy's and S. Klein. S. Klein is on the lower end of the sort of socioeconomic ladder here at this time in New York City, whereas at this time it was $5 for a dress at S. Klein, and Macy's it was going to charge you $15, right? And Saks Fifth Avenue, ask your grandparents about that one. Regardless, his method was pretty simple. He just wanted to go up to people and catch them with R. So he would go up and say, okay, well, where are the women's shoes? And if the women's shoes were on the 4th floor, the person would say, 4th floor. And if he would listen for that R.
And he would write down all these variables he could about them, their approximate age, what gender he perceived them to be, what floor in the store, the location in the store, kind of different information about him as background. And what he ended up finding was that if you go into the S client, the lower end store, and you ask, oh, what floor are the women's shoes on? And they'd say 4th floor. And he goes, excuse me? And the person repeats back 4th floor. And if you go into the Saks Fifth Avenue, they're much less likely to pronounce back with an R-less pronunciation. So this was a big finding. This was a finding that it's not just dialectal geography that determines how you sound. It's actually social characteristics, it's class, it's gender, it's all these other issues. And so that broadens our scope a little bit, right? Like, we might consider slang to be something that's really heavily used by young people. So perhaps we can say that, when you're young, you use slang, it's that kind of a relationship. But let's think and contrast slang as a category alongside jargon. Now, jargon is a sort of technical vocabulary. It's very specific terminology when you know what it is, and if you don't know what it is, you don't know the jargon, then you might not have any way of knowing that, right? It could be really fuzzy for you. Or it could be a word that in the common parlance is really fuzzy, but in the jargon is very, very specific, like intersectionality. Sometimes jargon terms break out into wider use. Sometimes words in the wider use get funneled down into pieces of jargon. It goes both ways. And that's sort of like slang in that way, right? Slang is also a set of vocabulary. Slang is typically more informal. Slang is sometimes considered to be offensive. Some slang terms are offensive anyhow. And then there's some slang terms are really, really common. Everybody uses them. They almost become not very slangy. Like TV kind of used to be slang and maybe isn't slang anymore. It's just the sort of word for TV now. Where telly, is not our word for TV. That's the Brits' word for it. They're both a special use of vocabulary. And they both kind of tell you something about who you are, right? Like if I say I'm going to go watch TV versus I'm going to go watch telly, that tells you about my nationality, right? That tells you about my background. That tells you about who I consider myself to be. I could make the choice and change and decide to use telly from now on. I probably won't. But that tells you something about the group that I feel like I belong to. And the fact that I said I'm going to go watch TV instead of watch television, right? That's so much more formal if I say it that way. It feels different. It's received differently by people you talk to. And of course, sometimes a word can be both. So it's not a property of the word, it's a property of the context, right? The context in which we use a word is the most important thing. So slag, as a piece of jargon, is a byproduct of metal creation, right? It's something that is created as a byproduct of metal. I don't know. I'm not a scientist in that kind of way. I'm a language scientist. I just know what it kind of is. However, if you go into England and you call a person a slag, that's an insult, right? That's sort of a gender-based insult in England. So this word, this phonetic string, slag, has both of these meanings at the same time. Just depends on the context, depends on the use. So slang then really isn't just a list of words. Slang is actually kind of a way of doing things. Slang is like a shifting system that we use in interactions with other people in order to mark what groups we belong in, right? So if I decide to strike up a conversation with you and I use all the latest slang, then that's sort of telling you something about who I am. Because I'm assuming you know all the latest slang and I'm assuming that you'll understand me, right? Think about that sort of Gricean way of thinking about language. Pictured here is Robin Lakoff. She was famous early kind of pusher, early mover and shaker in this world of language and gender. She was famous for a book called Language in a Woman's Place. And she found these sorts of patterns that very much fit the style of dialectology kind of way of looking at language and gender, right? So she said, well, women are associated with these kinds of features. So she found that women in her study were more likely to use tag questions and hedge words. So if, rather than saying, oh boy, the weather's terrible today, she found that women were more likely to say, oh, well, the weather's terrible today, isn't it? Right, to kind of invite that agreement or invite that conversational next step. She also found that women were more likely to use boosting language, so exaggeration language, like, I'm so happy to see you, oh, it's so good that you finally came here, right? Those sorts of exaggerations. She also found that uptalk, the kind of thing that I'm doing right now, was more likely to be to happen among women. That's my understanding of what she sort of found, but it's pretty common nowadays to perceive that uptalk as being age-driven or some other sort of factor. Let's sort of push past that way of thinking about language into sort of interactional space, right? Deborah Tannen was another early kind of famous linguist in the world of language and gender, and she did a lot of work on what she called the report versus rapport style, the rapport versus report style of information exchange in gendered conversations, among men's conversation, among women's conversation. So one of the things she uses is an example of the troubles talk. I know that you have all engaged in this genre of conversation before, the telling of the day's troubles. Who do you have at the end of the day to complain to, right? To tell all the things that went wrong to. Oh, you'll never believe what happened to me. I almost got in a car accident. And then this ridiculous professor of mine released this incredibly long video, and I just have to go through and take notes on the whole thing, and he talks so fast. Who do you have to tell those troubles to at the end of the day? That's the sort of genre of conversation we're thinking about here. And so basically what Deborah Tannen argued was that women have a more rapport-building style. She argued that women are more likely to have a connection-seeking style in the troubles talk, right? And so she argued that women were going to tell the troubles to the other person as a way of bonding socially. And that when men heard these troubles, they perceived them to be problems that needed to be solved right away. And that got into miscommunications. So she perceived gendered conversations as cross-cultural communications, right? She perceived men talking to women the same way that she perceived Americans talking to people from China, right? It was just two totally different cultures coming together into this place. The sort of men are from Mars, women are from Venus theory of language. So she's arguing that women are sort of pro-social and men are more sort of cold and scientific in that sort of way. Sort of similar to what the previous author we just saw was arguing as well. However, there is another way of thinking about the world. Authors like Penny Eckert have argued that actually, while the research on gender and conversation among English speakers tends to focus on cooperation, and tends to focus on support, what you find if you engage in a long-term study with women and women's conversation is that women, just like men, establish hierarchies of dominance, establish, as this author puts it, sanctioning of each other's behaviors in he said, she said discussions, pre-adolescent and adolescent girls developing cliques, ganging up on one another, using clever insults as sort of games to frame certain people as good or bad. You don't see when you ask women, hey, women out there in the world, this is so much less awkward to do in person. Do you find that your experience growing up as a woman was marked by support and pro-social behavior? You usually get a big no from that, right? And it's not that we are arguing that women are necessarily super competitive, it's just that there's not those sorts of fundamental men are from Mars, women are from Venus differences that we see. So much of the differences are driven by conditioning. We want to move past this kind of two divides viewpoint of language and gender work. This sort of language and gender work that says, well, if you're a woman, you're likely to do this, the same way that the old school sociolinguistic work said, well, if you're from New York, you're less likely to use R. What does that mean? Let's make it fine-grained and zoom in. Let's think about moment-to-moment interaction. Do you know anyone who is a one-upper? Here's what I'm talking about, if you don't know what I'm talking about.
Hi everyone, I'm Mary. I just want to thank you so much for volunteering at St. Angel's Thanksgiving Soup Kitchen. These dinners are so fun. Last year we ate and laughed and partied, and it was so hard that we didn't get out of here until like 8:30. I'm talking PM.
Well, I'm Lisa, and it's my first time doing this. I'm excited.
And I'm Lou. And seeing all these wonderful faces here today, it really warms my heart.
It warms my heart, too. Mine's burning a lot, though. It's like a little ball of fire under my bra. Can't say the Pledge of Allegiance or I'll burn my hands. So I guess my heart's a little warmer than yours. Oh, thank you. Penelope, was it? Oh, good. Well, as I was saying, Thanksgiving is a special time for me. Interesting fact, thanks to Ancestry.com, I just found out that I had relatives come over on the Mayflower. My relatives came over on the April flower. So they got here 1 month before yours did. So.
Do you know anyone like that? I know a few people like that. How does someone gain a reputation as being a one-upper? Through interactions with people. There's nothing in your genes about one-upperness. You're not going to find the gene that drives one-upping. It's a social stance that results from how people talk to each other. If you make a claim about your life and someone else always responds with something about theirs, that's a sort of a one-upsmanship that we think about, and it becomes an identity. It becomes a habit, and it becomes an identity. So these linguists were just talking about Penelope Eckert, and the other one, couldn't think of the name of. Could edit that in, but it's still early in the semester. Sally McConnell-Genet, both pictured here. They raised criticism of this sort of old school work, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. They said it's kind of stereotype driven, right? You start with the stereotype that these women are demure and soft and social, and then you go out and you find it, and you say, oh gee, wow, that's not science. Right? That's not science. Those are really broad conclusions to draw from a really limited set of data, and it just so happens to be that all that data looks exactly like you. Right? It's you and your friends, and you are studying people who sound like you. That's the opposite of what we want to do in descriptive linguistics. So what we get is this idea of this moment-to-moment interaction in language. Performing an identity in language. These recurrent patterns of talk, like coming home and talking over dinner. You know, how was your day? How was your day? Eleanor Ox and Carolyn Taylor did this really interesting study of two-parent and children households. They studied 7 different households over a long period of time, gathering conversational data from them. And they usually found that there were multiple roles being performed in any given conversation, right? So a mother would introduce a story about her child to her husband. So she's playing the role of both kind of mother and wife at the same time, right? You get these complex stories once you really start to analyze what's going on in them. This comes back to this idea of the troubles talk that we were talking about earlier as well. So we get this dynamic where a person is introducing a story to you, and that's not usually the child introducing the story in these patterns of talk that Ox and Taylor found. They found that it was usually a parent, usually a mother, who was introducing a story for the benefit of the father. You'll never guess what your son did today. That sort of thing. This was usually interpreted by the father as a topic to be commented on, or oftentimes as a problem to be found with whatever the story was, right? This is something that we found repeatedly in this sort of data. And there's some really interesting ways in which fathers position themselves routinely as the people who must be listened to, the people in charge linguistically. But I want to move on this very brief touch of language and gender. We have a whole language and society, language and culture series of classes if you want to talk a lot more about that, and there's so much more to talk about it. I want to do just a couple of minutes talking about African American English, also called a bunch of other names. Talking very briefly about language and race. As a little bit of background, I'm going to let John Baugh do the talking.
African American language, from my perspective, is extremely diverse. And when you think about the broad population of African Americans, African American language for me would be the language that's spoken by almost anyone of African descent. But that then parses into some very, very different groups. And I concentrate primarily on those individuals who are slave descendants and whose ancestors were once enslaved within the United States, because that African American population traces their linguistic ancestry back to very special circumstances that differ from other African Americans, for example, who have come to the United States of their own volition. So President Obama is an African American, but he doesn't trace his personal heritage to that of anyone who was enslaved in the United States, whereas Michelle Obama is a slave descendant. So depending upon the background of the individual, they may or may not have slave descendancy within their history. And those who are slave descendants still span a linguistic continuum of individuals like Condoleezza Rice, who speak mainstream standard American English, as well as Snoop Dogg and hip-hop artists who are fluent in the vernacular, and more than that, whose professional well-being depends on their fluency in the vernacular. And so that flexible and elastic linguistic situation is what I think of when I talk about African American language.
So when we talk about African American English, it's really important then that we realize the difference between language and race, and somewhat realize the artificial nature of race, frankly, the sort of constructed nature of it. So typically when we're talking about African American English, we're talking about a variety that the public calls Ebonics. Now this is a term that a black educational psychologist named Robert Williams coined in 1973, and he was doing studies on exams. And he found that there was a huge linguistic component of how well students did on exams. Depending on how you use the language, how you use the language to explain the material, you could have widely different test results in black and white communities. And so he coined this term from a kind of combination of ebony and phonics to come with Ebonics. Sometimes people use this as a bad word and say, oh, he's just speaking Ebonics, but that's not really appropriate response linguistically. You'll see in the linguistic literature, if you go Googling for it, a bunch of different names. I typically call it Ave, or African American Vernacular English. However, most common today to hear it called AAE, or African American English. And again, as John Baugh mentioned, this is something that originated in slavery, so you have a direct connection here to West African languages that were historically spoken by enslaved people before they were brought here. It does, in most speakers of Ave, those speakers share some features with the southern region, so like R-lessness, things like that, things like monophthongization, as we'll talk about. And there is also some regional dialectal variation, right? The Ave that's spoken in Louisiana is not the same as the Ave that's spoken in Detroit, is not the same as what's spoken in California, is not the same spoken everywhere in California. Some pretty common sort of properties of Ave, as you may have heard, are monophthongization, so turning a diphthong to a monophthong, again, like many varieties of English around the world. Many varieties are R-vocalizing, so they're non-rhotic varieties, again, like many varieties of English, including British English and American English varieties. Some speakers don't have interdental fricatives, and so turn those into stops like D and T, or turn them into fricatives of a sort of labiodental variety, or like F and V, again, like many varieties of English around the world. One of my favorite examples is consonant cluster simplification, which can make a difference in how certain words are understood and then how certain words are pluralized, right? So the word text, for instance, has a plural for me of texts. But if you simplify the consonant cluster to texts, then you get the plural of tesses or texes. And so then you get that wonderful Cardi B line.
I like texts from my exes when they want a second chance.
You also get a lot of mergers, similar again to some of the southern varieties, like the pin-pen merger, very common in a lot of, again, varieties of American English, but also common in Ave. However, there does tend to be a resistance to the cot merger across Ave speakers across the country. There tends to be a distinction in those two vowels. Many Ave speakers have second person y'all instead of yous or yins or just plain you or you guys. Also, it tends to be the case that the terms for pop versus soda differentiate black speakers from white speakers in a region. So the 3 users of cold drink in a New Orleans survey were all black people. The only people who said those terms were black. In Atlanta, 3 of the 4 African American speakers used soda instead of Coke, whereas most of the white speakers around there use Coke famously, as we know. Another thing that you see really commonly is existential it. And what I mean by that is in standard American English, you have both existential it and there. So I could say there's a lot of people here and it's really cold outside. But in Ave, there tends to be the use of it for both of those. It's a lot of people in here. It's really cold outside. Typically in the third person, the singular will be unmarked as well as the genitive will also be unmarked. So
when my name come up, respect it. Put some respect on my name. You understand me? When y'all saying my name, put some respect on it.
Some common syntactic properties include the single most misunderstood, single most stereotyped feature of Ave, which is habitual B, invariant B. A brilliant study to indicate the difference between the way that most non-Ave speakers versus the way most Ave speakers understand habitual B comes from a black PhD. She was a student at the time named Janice Jackson. Janice Jackson? I've actually never known how to pronounce that correctly. And she does this beautiful test involving Cookie Monster and Elmo. Elmo is over here eating cookies. Cookie Monster is over there not eating cookies. When you ask little black kids who be eating cookies, and you ask little white kids who be eating cookies, you get 2 different sets of data. The white kids, when asked who be eating cookies, say, Elmo is eating cookies. When you ask the little black kids who be eating cookies, the black kids responded, well, Cookie Monster be eating cookies, but he's not eating any cookies right now. Also, famously, the copula is deleted in many contexts in Ave, so not in the first person, so you could never say I in the building, you'd only say we in the building in Ave varieties. But you do see it deleted in the second person, plural, the third person, etc., or being optional. I want to end this lecture with a little bit of a controversy, and you can expect to see a discussion question about this at some point in the future. Something happened in 1996 that put linguists on the front page of every newspaper in the world. How did that happen? How did a school board meeting put linguistics into the world in 1996? Well, Oakland Schools in California was trying to take advantage of a pot of money designed to teach speakers of second languages. And they were also trying to deal with the slow growth of Ave-speaking children and their progression to learn to read. So Oakland declared that a set of their African-American students had Ebonics as their primary language, and it was a different language from Standard English, and so they would teach Ebonics reading and Standard English reading using language acquisition methods in a way that we know from educational and linguistic research works pretty well. There was immediate backlash from everyone. Criticism came from all sides. The New York Times said that this is something that stigmatized a set of students, that they didn't need to be stigmatized, that this shouldn't be encouraged, is what the Detroit News said. The Reverend Jesse Jackson said that we're making slang into a language, but we haven't talked about slang at all in this conversation about Ave. Ave is a grammatical pattern. It's not slang. Governments responded in kind, so the states of Georgia and South Carolina immediately banned the teaching of Ebonics. And would you believe me if I told you that the state of Oklahoma declared a state of emergency about the teaching of Ebonics? Well, you should. Because in the first session of the 46th legislature of 1997, they immediately produced an act prohibiting the teaching of Ebonics and declaring an emergency in order to get it done. How do you like that? Linguistics. It's real. So here's what we're doing next time. Thank you for making it almost all the way to the end of this video lecture. Next time I want to talk a little bit more about language and culture. There's not really a lot in the book about that, so I'm not convinced if I'll give you a reading about it or not. I might just let this one slide. We're mostly going to focus on things like kinship terms, like linguistic relativity, and politeness, face theory. I'll explain what all that means later. In the meantime, take care.
Y'all finished or y'all done? I ain't got no more talking. Let's rock.